Evan loved taking long walks at night, exploring parts of the city others wouldn't dare to. One evening, he stumbled upon an old railway station, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The station's once grand clock tower now leaned precariously, its face frozen in time. The air was thick with decay, but something about the place felt alive. As he stood on the cracked platform, a faint rumble shook the ground beneath him. In disbelief, Evan saw a train pulling into the station. The cars were rusted, windows shattered, yet it moved as if powered by unseen energy. The screeching of its brakes echoed through the night, and the train came to a halt. Steam hissed from the rusted engine, clouding the platform. The doors of the middle car slid open with a deafening groan. Curiosity overtook him, and he stepped closer. The interior was dimly lit by flickering lanterns, revealing empty seats and suitcases from an era long past. A faint voice whispered, "All aboard," though there was no one in sight. Evan hesitated but felt an inexplicable pull, like the train was calling to him. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the train jerked forward. As it moved, the world outside transformed. Trees wilted, buildings crumbled, and the sky turned an unnatural shade of crimson. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers became louder, forming unintelligible words. Suddenly, the seats weren't empty anymore. Ghostly figures appeared, their hollow eyes fixed on Evan. A woman in a tattered dress turned her head slowly toward him and said, "You shouldn't have come here." Panicking, Evan ran to the nearest door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, desperate to escape. The train lurched to a stop, and the ghostly passengers rose from their seat. Their murmurs turned into haunting screams as they advanced toward him. The doors flew open, and Evan was thrown out onto the platform. When he looked around, the station was eerily silent. The train, the tracks, even the platform itself were gone, replaced by an empty field. But Evan wasn't home. The city lights were missing, the stars unfamiliar. The ground beneath him shifted unnaturally, and distant whispers began to grow louder again. The train hadn't taken him home, it had taken him somewhere far worse. Story 2. Rachel took the subway home every night after work. It was a routine she never thought much about, until one fateful evening. The train was unusually empty, and the air inside the car was stale and oppressive. As the train sped through the underground tunnels, Rachel noticed something odd. The stations they passed were unlit and unfamiliar. She checked her phone for the time, but it displayed an error message. No service. Turn back. Her stomach churned. The train didn't stop. The lights in the car flickered, and when they stabilized, she realized she wasn't alone. A man sat at the far end, his face obscured by shadow. "Excuse me," Rachel called out, her voice shaky. "Do you know where this train is going?" The man slowly turned toward her, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. "This is the last stop," he whispered. Rachel's heart raced as the train plunged into complete darkness. The lights flickered back on briefly, and the man was gone. The train finally screeched to a halt. The doors opened, revealing a station unlike any she'd ever seen. The walls were covered in decaying posters, and the air reeked of mold. A sign above the exit read, "End of the line." Rachel stepped off the train, desperate to find a way out. As she walked toward the exit, she heard the screech of metal behind her. The train was leaving, but it wasn't the same train anymore. Its cars were now filled with shadowy figures, all staring at her as it sped away. She turned back to the exit, but the stairs were gone. The station stretched endlessly, its walls closing in around her. The whispers began, soft at first, then louder, echoing her name. Rachel screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the laughter of unseen entities. She wasn't just lost. She was part of the station now. Story 3. Late one night, Liam boarded a nearly empty train. It was the last train of the night, heading to his quiet suburban stop. The ride was uneventful until the conductor entered the car. His uniform was immaculate but old-fashioned, and his eyes never blinked. "Tickets, please," the conductor said, his voice low and hollow. Liam fumbled for his ticket, handing it over. The conductor inspected it carefully, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach his lifeless eyes. "Wrong ticket," the conductor said. "This train doesn't go where you think it does." Before Liam could respond, the lights went out. When they came back on, the other passengers were gone. Only Liam and the conductor remained. The train began moving faster, the windows showing nothing but pitch-black void. "What's happening? Where are we going?" Liam shouted. The conductor turned, his smile widening unnaturally. "To the place where time stops," he said. The train screeched to a halt, and Liam was thrown from his seat. The doors opened, revealing an endless expanse of fog. The conductor gestured for him to step out. "Your stop," he said. Liam refused, clinging to his seat, but shadowy hands emerged from the fog, pulling him out. The train disappeared into the mist, leaving Liam behind, trapped in the timeless void with no way out. Story 4. Sam was running late for his night shift when he boarded the subway. The train car was empty except for an old man sitting in the corner, muttering to himself. Sam ignored him, taking a seat near the door. The train plunged into a tunnel, and the lights flickered. When they stabilized, Sam noticed something odd. Outside the window, there were no walls or passing light. Instead, an eerie void stretched endlessly, blacker than night. The old man's muttering grew louder. Sam leaned closer to hear him. "They never come back," the man said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "What?" Sam asked, confused. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, walked to the far end of the car and vanished, right through the wall. Panic set in as Sam realized the train wasn't stopping. The void outside seemed to move, shifting and writhing like it was alive. Suddenly, faces appeared in the darkness, their hollow eyes watching him. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Next stop, end of the line." The train slowed, and the doors opened to a platform covered in moss and broken tiles. A shadowy figure stood waiting, its hand outstretched. Sam froze, but the figure stepped aboard. As it approached, the faces outside the windows began to scream, their voices filling the car. The shadowy figure leaned down, whispering into Sam's ear, "You've arrived?" And then the train's lights went out for good. Story 5. Late one foggy night, Mia decided to take a shortcut home through the old railway track. She'd heard the urban legend about the Phantom Express, a train that only appeared in the dead of night, carrying souls to the afterlife, but she never believed it. As she walked along the tracks, a faint rumbling grew louder. Out of the mist, an ancient steam engine emerged, its wheels screeching against the rails. The train was impossibly large, its black metal gleaming in the moonlight. Mia froze, watching as the train slowed to a stop in front of her. A conductor stepped out, his uniform pristine but his face obscured by shadows. "Boarding?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. Mia shook her head, stepping back. "I'm just passing through." The conductor tipped his hat. "This train doesn't take no for an answer." Before she could run, spectral hands emerged from the car, pulling her inside. The train roared to life, speeding through the fog. Inside, Mia saw passengers, translucent figures with sorrow etched on their faces. They whispered in unison, "Don't look back." But Mia couldn't resist. She turned to see her reflection in the train's glass window, only it wasn't her. It was a pale, hollow-eyed version of herself, staring back with a haunting grin. The train never stopped, and neither did Mia's screams. Story 6. Connor worked late one night and caught the last train home. The car was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the engine breaking the silence. He leaned against the window, watching as stations passed by one after the other. But after several stops, Connor noticed something strange. The names on the station signs were illegible, their letters twisting and warping. The train slowed at one of these stations, and the doors opened to complete darkness. A man in a dark coat stepped aboard, sitting across from Connor. His eyes were hidden under the brim of his hat, and he smelled faintly of earth. "You don't belong here," the man said. "What are you talking about?" Connor asked, his voice shaky. The man smiled grimly. This train doesn't go back. Suddenly, the train jerked forward, speeding faster than before. The lights flickered, and when they returned, the man was gone. The train stopped abruptly at a station that seemed to stretch infinitely into the void. The walls were covered in faintly glowing markings, like ancient runes. Connor tried to stay on the train, but the intercom crackled to life. End of the line. All passengers must exit. As he stepped onto the platform, the train disappeared, leaving him stranded in the endless station with no way out. Story 7. It started as a normal commute for Lily. She arrived at her local station and waited on the platform, the autumn wind biting at her cheek. The clock above ticked steadily, but the train didn't arrive. She checked her phone. No delays were reported. The other passengers seemed unbothered, some scrolling their phones, others chatting. Then, without warning, a chilling breeze swept through the platform, and Lily noticed something odd. Everyone else was gone. The station was completely silent. No announcements, no hum of electricity, nothing. Just as she was about to leave, a train emerged from the tunnel. It was ancient, with cracked windows and peeling paint, but it pulled to a stop in front of her as if she were expected. Hesitant but curious, Lily stepped aboard. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth. The seats were torn, and cobwebs clung to the corners. She chose a seat and waited, but the train didn't move. Then she heard it whispering. It was faint at first but grew louder, coming from all directions. The whispers spoke her name, repeating it over and over. Panicking, Lily ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The lights in the car dimmed, and the whispers turned into screams. When the lights flickered back on, she was no longer alone. Shadowy figures filled the car, their faces blurred and distorted. One leaned close to her and whispered, "You shouldn't have boarded." The train began to move, but the world outside wasn't her city anymore. It was a barren wasteland, stretching endlessly into darkness. Lily never made it home, and the train? It never returned. Story 8. Tom worked late that night, barely catching the last train. As he stepped into the car, he realized it was empty, something unusual for a Friday night. The train sped through the tunnels, but after a while, Tom noticed it wasn't stopping at any stations. He pressed the button to alert the conductor, but nothing happened. The overhead lights flickered, and a low hum filled the car. Suddenly, the train stopped in the middle of a tunnel. Tom peered out the window, but all he saw was darkness. Then, faint footsteps echoed through the car. "Hello?" he called out. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a conductor's uniform. His eyes glowed faintly, and his skin looked waxy, almost like a mannequin's. "Ticket," the man said, holding out a skeletal hand. "I already scanned it," Tom replied, his voice shaking. The conductor tilted his head unnaturally. "No, you didn't." Tom reached into his pocket to find his ticket, but his hands trembled as the conductor stepped closer. Behind him, more figures appeared, each one more grotesque than the last. They whispered in unison, "No one leaves the Midnight Express." Tom ran to the next car, but the doors led him back to the same one. The figures closed in, their whispers turning into deafening shrieks. The train began to move again, its destination unknown. The next morning, the train arrived at the station, empty. Tom was never seen again. Story 9. Jacob loved exploring abandoned places, and the old railway station outside town was his latest obsession. Locals warned him about the screaming tracks, but he shrugged it off as superstition. One night, armed with a flashlight and camera, Jacob ventured out to the station. The air was heavy with fog, and the tracks shimmered faintly under the moonlight. As he approached, he heard it, a low, mournful wail echoing through the night. It sounded almost human. Jacob followed the sound, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The tracks seemed to stretch endlessly, and the wailing grew louder. Then, out of nowhere, a train whistle pierced the silence. A massive black train roared toward him, its headlights blinding. Jacob jumped off the tracks, landing hard on the ground. When he looked up, the train had vanished. But the wailing continued, now coming from behind him. He turned to see figures standing on the tracks, their mouths open wide in silent screams. Their faces were pale, their eyes lifeless. One of them stepped forward and whispered, "Help us!" Jacob ran, but the figures followed, their whispers turning into ear-piercing shrieks. He tripped and fell, and when he looked up, the train was barreling toward him again. The next morning, all that was found of Jacob was his flashlight, still glowing faintly on the tracks. Story 10. The train conductor's voice echoed over the intercom. Next stop, Maple Grove. Lena settled into her seat, exhausted after a long day at work. She always took the 10:15 train home, reliable, uneventful, and just quiet enough for her to close her eyes for the ride. Tonight, however, felt different. The train seemed unusually cold, the kind of chill that settled into your bone. She pulled her jacket tighter and glanced around. The car was nearly empty, save for a man sitting 2 rows ahead, his head bent low, a faded hat obscuring his face. Lena yawned, ready to doze off, when she noticed the number above the door. Car 13. She frowned. There wasn't supposed to be a car 13 on this train. She'd been riding this route for years, and the train had always skipped that number. The intercom crackled again. "Passengers, please remain seated until the next stop." Lena shifted uncomfortably. The voice sounded strange, off. It wasn't the usual monotone announcement but something deeper, almost guttural. The train entered a tunnel, and the lights flickered briefly. When they stabilized, the man in the hat was gone. Lena sat up straight, scanning the car. There was no way he could have left. The doors hadn't opened. Her unease grew, but she tried to shake it off. Then came the whispering. At first, it was faint, like a soft breeze, but it grew louder, surrounding her. The words were unintelligible, but their tone was unmistakably menacing. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The lights flickered again, and when they returned, the car was full. But these weren't ordinary passengers. They were pale, almost translucent, their faces twisted in silent agony. Some had empty eye sockets, others with lips sewn shut. They sat motionless, their hollow gazes fixed on her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She tried to stand, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. One of the figures, a woman in a tattered dress, turned her head slowly toward Lena. Her mouth opened wide, unnaturally so, and she let out a low, guttural moan. "Leave," the woman rasped, her voice distorted, as though layered with countless others. The train lurched violently, and Lena was thrown back into her seat. The car plunged into darkness, and the whispering turned into screams. When the lights returned, the figures were gone, but the man with the hat was back. This time, he was sitting directly across from her. His head lifted slowly, revealing a face that was anything but human. His eyes glowed faintly, and his skin was stretched taut over sharp, skeletal features. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. I just want to go home," Lena stammered. The man tilted his head. "Home?" he repeated, almost mockingly. "This is your home now." The train screeched to a halt, and the doors opened to a station Lena didn't recognize. The air was thick and cold, the platform covered in moss and grime. A sign above read, "Car 13, Terminal Station." The man stood, his movements jerky and unnatural. He gestured toward the open door. "All passengers must disembark." Lena shook her head. "I'm not getting off." The man's grin widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You don't have a choice." Shadowy figures began emerging from the walls of the car, their hands reaching for her. The lights flickered wildly as the shadows dragged her toward the door. She screamed, grabbing onto the seat, but their strength was overwhelming. As Lena was pulled onto the platform, the train vanished, leaving her in an endless void of darkness. The shadowy figures surrounded her, their whispers filling the air. And then, silence. The next morning, the 10:15 train arrived at its usual stop, its passengers boarding without a second thought. Car 13 was empty, as always, but if you listened closely, you could still hear Lena's faint whispers echoing through the car, begging for someone to find her.